Welcome to this special Royal Television Society event hosted by ITN in the eye of the storm. Where next for journalism after the Capitol? I'm Cathy Newman, I present Channel 4 News. I'm with you for the next hour and thank you very much for joining us. So a year ago, the insurrection at the Capitol sent shockwaves around the world. This was an historic attack on the fundamental tenets of democracy, triggered by a wave of misinformation and disinformation. The consequences for politics and media remain stark as the mistrust of established institutions deepens. Following the events at the Capitol and the approaching American midterm elections, recent polling found that 64% of Americans think their democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. Now, some commentators in the US even say there is a dark prospect of another American civil war. And I'm not talking about, one where people fight on the streets, but a series of events such as terrorist attacks that lead to mass casualties. And these issues aren't confined to the US. Here in the UK, there are those who think a British version of the storming of the Capitol is not inconceivable. This session then aims to understand the role of journalism in reporting on anti-democratic movements and what measures need to be in place to ensure that trusted news is supported in this increasingly polarized environment, whether that's through legislation, regulation, or new funding models. Please do submit questions in the Q&A section. I'll take as many as I can throughout the event and also at the end. So I'd like to introduce our excellent panelists. Damien Collins MP is chair of the Joint Committee on the Draft Online Safety Bill and All-Party Parliamentary Group on Media Freedom. Lucy Powell MP is Shadow Culture Secretary. She was appointed to the role in November 2021 and was previously Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. Brian Stelter is CNN Chief Media Correspondent, and he's the anchor of Reliable Sources, which examines the week's top media stories. He's the Chief Media Correspondent for CNN Worldwide. And Robert Moore, ITV News, is an award-winning Washington-based correspondent for ITV News. He was the only TV correspondent in the world to accompany the insurrectionist mob as it stormed Congress on January the 6th, 2021. And I'd like to just kick off by playing Robert's report on the storming of the Capitol now.
USA! 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 USA!
For 4 years, we have witnessed turmoil in America, but nothing quite like this. The pro-Trump crowd fought with the police, trying to break through their lines, intoxicated by the unlikely prospect of reversing America's election outcome. We watched as the standoff continued for at least an hour. Tear gas canisters were fired from the very stage on which Joe Biden will be inaugurated. But for Capitol Hill police officers, this was a losing battle.
This is exactly what was feared, but in no way is this a surprise. It has been fueled by the president's rhetoric, and it's increasingly clear this election has not healed the wounds. It has simply amplified them.
We followed the aggrieved and infuriated Trump supporters as they stormed the building. Through broken windows and doors they had forced open.
Well, incredible reporting, Robert. That was just an excerpt of the report, of course, but it is, it sends shivers down your spine even watching it now. When you were in there, in that melee, the mob, did you know at the time what impact that report would have?
Well, I'll come to that just in a second, Cathy, but first of all, thank you so much for letting me be part of this panel and be an evangelist for sort of frontline and eyewitness reporting, which is it's so important. This is part of our sort of broadcasting landscape. It's great that Damian and Lucy are part of this conversation too. We need the political support for Britain's brand of broadcasting, and great that Brian is with us too. Brian, as many people will know, is sort of America's preeminent media analyst, but more than that, he is a friend to besieged newsrooms around the world, whether that's under populist pressure or whether it is economic pressure. Brian is a good friend to to all journalists. In terms of the impact of my reporting, I mean, clearly, we were aware at the time, as the cliche goes, that we were kind of eyewitnesses to history. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity, Cathy, in some ways, to interview insurrectionists in real time, talk to them as they were quite literally ransacking the corridors of power. But I think what I felt then and what I feel now, and I think this is the most relevant part of this conversation we're having for the next hour or so, is that I did feel that my reporting was built on ITN's long heritage of sort of eyewitness journalism. It's what we do. And I think it's what British television does very well, because although, that was a success for ITV News that day, I'm well aware, we're all well aware at ITV News, that it's also something that Sky News, that the BBC News, that Channel 4 News do exceptionally well. In other words, what I think British television has is this kind of brand of eyewitness frontline reporting that helps to sort of deconstruct disinformation and conspiracy theories very effectively. And I think that's certainly something worth preserving going forward. So if my contribution on January the 6th was a small way of saying, look, British television is really good at sort of eyewitness reporting, and that's more essential than ever before, then I'm pretty satisfied with that.
Brian, I want to bring you in here, because what impact did Robert's report have in the US?
It was a unique video. It was a unique report with unique perspectives that we didn't otherwise see that day. And that's why, from the point of view of a digital media person, he went viral, and the report went viral. On January 6th, on that afternoon, most of the cameras, most of the views that we had were far away. So most of the live shots we saw of the storming of the Capitol did not convey just how atrocious and violent it was. Sometimes from some angles from far away, it looked more like a party than a ransacking and a violent event. So to have up close video that was turned around within hours was really, really significant. In fact, the attack was on a Wednesday, and it wasn't until Friday that I think many Americans started to realize just how horrible it was, just how awful it was. In fact, that Saturday, I remember writing a story for the CNN.com homepage that said, this was a lot worse than it looked live. But your team knew immediately, Robert, and saw immediately and conveyed that on the same day by turning it around and broadcasting it immediately. That is why it was so important on television and online. And that's why so many Americans were sharing the video, because it was a point of view of the riot they had not seen yet. We had mostly seen images from far away. Think about it. Most of the reporters there that day, they were already inside the Capitol, and they took shelter. And for very good reasons, considering the violence and the threats against the media. So it was a unique vantage point on that day.
I just want to pick you up on that precise point, because we had a great question already from Simon Albury, who says, why was Robert Moore the only TV reporter to do what he did? I just wondered what your thought was on that.
Well, Robert, I defer to you, but my impression is that there were a lot of reporters inside the Capitol trying to cover the proceedings. There were a lot of reporters outside the Capitol, but further away. So they were walking with protesters, not necessarily going into the building, but I think Robert probably has a better sense of that than I do.
Robert?
Well, there were reporters inside, there were reporters outside. Brian's absolutely right. And many of them doing, remarkable work, telling eyewitness accounts of what it was like to be inside the chamber, or to be locked in a sealed room with lawmakers who were clearly frightened for their lives. So we were not in any sense the only reporters there that day. Far from it. People were doing remarkably strong work. What was unique about our view was we were had infiltrated the mob and went in with them. If you like, we were embedded with the crowd. And that's because many other broadcasters were doing live reporting, as Brian was saying, or else they were locked into Capitol Hill secure rooms. So, it was a complex set of circumstances, but in no way were we the only journalists there. And many people have done magnificent journalism in the following months of, trying to track the insurrectionists and looking at the implications and ramifications of that horrible attack. We were just the only ones embedded with them all as they crossed the threshold.
And if I can just add one more note to that, it's important to have professional television video of an attack like that. We have a lot of police body cam video now, which is important. We have a lot of amateur eyewitness video from rioters, and that's important too. But it's critical to have objective third-party video of an act of terror, of
Right.
a crime. And what we see in your video is a massive crime scene. It has been documented. It's also important to have that global or that outsider point of view as an American, to see a day that's so disgraceful documented by your crew, and to have it through your eyes is also really valuable. A lot of Americans don't want to acknowledge the degree to which this is a stain on the country's reputation, but it is. The first time that I was able to go to DC last year and lay eyes on the Capitol with, for the first time since the attack, I had never felt that kind of emotion where I was so grateful it was still there and still standing and still safe. We used to take it for granted. We can't anymore. And we need third-party reporting to remind us of that.
Well, let's get the lawmakers' perspective now. Damien Collins, how important was it? We've heard from the journalists, their views on how crucial that report was. What about from a politician's perspective?
Well, the amazing thing about the report is that you can really see what's going on. And for something like the 6th of January, an insurrection based on a campaign of lies over many months, to actually have the objective truth being recorded and broadcast around the world is incredibly important. It was undeniable people were in those buildings. It was undeniable that they were behaving the way they were behaving. So sharing that truth is important. The trouble with the media landscape we have at the moment is, for many of the people who are part of that riotous mob, they don't get their news from trusted news sources. They get it from discrete social media channels where they get their version of the truth. And so it's so important that journalists can tell that story. If you look around the world at democracies that are in trouble, the one common theme they have is they have weak independent media. They have media that has been undermined, and that legitimate voices are pushed to the margins. And this also is the complaint of people like Maria Ressa, who's just won the Nobel Peace Prize. She runs an amazing news organization in the Philippines, but a news organization that is constantly attacked and undermined by the government of that country, and on social media, her voice is being drowned out by orchestrated campaigns. So to have that footage, from the Capitol go around the world, I think was really important.
And I want to delve a little bit deeper into those issues that you've just raised in a minute. Lucy Powell, brief response from you there.
Yeah, thanks, Cathy, and really good to be here with everybody else. I mean, it was a really, really powerful report, Robert. I remember watching it, at the time and many times since, and some of your follow-up work as well, which was really good. And I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I know we're going to talk a bit more about some of those issues, but I think you're absolutely right that this is also, there is something unique about British broadcasting, British news gathering, that enables us to tell these stories in some of that way, the public broadcasting ethos, the way in which we have that sort of mixed model of funding that enables that to take place, and the value that we place on investigative and deep dive impartial journalism. It's very much part of our British culture, isn't it? And some of these things obviously are under threat. They're under threat in this country, they're under threat around the world, and all the work that Damian and colleagues and others have been doing around how the online space needs much tougher regulation is really a big part of this conversation as well, and also about how good journalism is paid for, how it's rewarded, or how it's not rewarded in some cases, and the impact that can have on democracies and our way of life when it isn't valued and it isn't funded and supported properly, which I fear, that is a trend that we're seeing globally, but also in this country as well.
Come back to that very point in just a moment. So let's just go a little bit deeper into how anti-democratic movements should be reported and the challenges for journalists. Brian, I want to start with you on this particular topic. The midterms are approaching. So what are the challenges looming, in the wake of the Capitol insurrection? What do journalists need to be alert to, and how are you tackling these challenges?
I think whether it's a national television network, whether it's a major publication or a local newspaper, we have to be explaining what democratic backsliding is and what it looks like and how we see it happening. What are the signs of erosion? Because they're usually not going to be visual and physical at the steps of a Capitol building, whether a state house or a national Capitol. they're usually going to happen in closed door meetings or in smaller hearing rooms or in council where voting rights are pulled back and when changes are made to the way votes are counted. All of those small steps, that's all erosion that needs to be documented and is being documented by local reporters and by national reporters in the US right now. The US is lucky to have a free and vibrant press that can do that. I share the concerns about other countries with weak independent media where none of that work is able to be done or is only able to be done in the shadows. I think there needs to be a renewed awareness that a free press is not possible without a vibrant democracy. And I think most Americans know that. I think, you tell me your impression in other countries. I think most Americans in the wake of 1/6 know the truth about what happened, know it was shameful, and know that we need a free press to continue to document this assault on democracy. However, there is a minority that is in denial about that or tells a very different story. And that battle, that tug of war, is going to be a story in the midterms and a story, I think, through the decade.
It's a sizable and growing minority, isn't it? That's the risk.
Yes, I agree that it is. I think it's very much a dispute within one party, within the Republican Party. It is an all-out brawl over Trump and Trumpism and the big lie. As we talk about the Capitol riot and the aftermath, it's all based on lies, and the press has to be forceful about identifying it as such. I think many networks and newspapers are. I think some are much weaker about it. And that's an important measuring stick. Where do newsrooms stand on telling it like it is, calling a lie, calling it out? That kind of journalism is indispensable. Most readers and viewers want it, but certainly some do not, and some are in denial about that. I think overall, whether in the US or elsewhere, what we need are more political reporters to think as democracy reporters. We have lots and lots and lots of politics coverage. It's very savvy and insider, at least we do in Washington. What we need is more democracy reporting, focusing less on the horse trading and more on keeping a healthy democracy, regardless of the outcome in the ballot box.
Robert, I wonder how important in this context and against that backdrop that Brian so expertly set out, how important is impartial TV journalism, do you think?
I think as Brian pointed out, on January the 6th, I was surrounded by hundreds of people with cameras, ironically, but they were all the kind of insurrectionists going in and live streaming on Facebook or on other social media platforms. So I think what Brian's point is the value of a professional television crew, one that has heritage and is experienced, and not only that has the infrastructure of a newsroom, of editorial management, understands safety protocols. That's hugely important. We couldn't have understood January the 6th, for example, without having had some deep reporting on the threat of right-wing militancy or conspiracy theorists. So I think, one of the key points, I think, Brian would share this view, is that we don't protect democracy by ignoring voices, however shrill they might be. Even those who want to dismantle democracy, we need to put them on air, because the job of journalists isn't to hide the discordant voices. It is to shine a light on everything that is happening in this incredibly diverse and complicated country. So, it's for us to do deep reporting on the movement of far-right militia movements, for example. So I think, our role is crystal clear. We have to shine a light on the extremism, what Brian has described as the backsliding and erosion of democracy. That is our role, not to call it for one side or the other, but to shine a light on it. And I think that's what deep reporting and eyewitness reporting is all about. And I have vast respect for the American cable networks, of which Brian is obviously a preeminent member. But the problem in many ways in the US cable sort of ecosystem is there's a tremendous amount of sort of panel discussions and studio debate. What I'm advocating for, what I'm a kind of an evangelist for, is the sort of eyewitness frontline reporting in which we deploy people into the field and listen in real time to the threats to democracy as they kind of organically grow. I think that's the way that we can best serve our television viewers at home.
Damien Collins, this is a really urgent debate in the UK right now, because yesterday we saw the government, as part of what's been dubbed Operation Red Meat, to try and shore up the Prime Minister's position. We saw the government announcing a freeze in the BBC licence fee for 2 years, and then I mean, promised in a tweet, slightly backtrack from that in the Commons, but to ditch the licence fee completely by 2027. I wondered how you viewed that in the context of this, the importance of the BBC being there as an impartial voice. How do you view that latest move by the government? You're on mute.
I was on mute. It was announced yesterday by the government, but it was the culmination of quite a lengthy negotiation process with the BBC. So it wasn't a policy that was sort of cooked up at the weekend. The government was in an ongoing discussion with the BBC over the licence fee settlement for the rest of the charter period, so for the next few years. And then beyond that, the question of whether the licence fee is the correct way of funding the BBC in the future is, it has been up for discussion for a number of years. And I think there are questions for the BBC about the way it is funded and whether in a digital age where people are increasingly used to paying for just what they consume, they have different subscriptions, does a catch-all license fee, are younger people in particular still going to take it up? We've had a few years now of declining license fee registrations. And but at the heart of this is that there's a question of how you fund it, but the fundamental question is, what resources does the BBC in particular need to continue its excellent work, and how will it be funded in the future? Because the BBC, like ITN, is a great global media brand that's trusted and respected around the world, hugely important not only for news gathering around the world, but for news gathering within this country as well. I mean, I'm sure Lucy would agree, we've all seen the hollowing out of local journalism in the UK, maybe not quite as dramatically as has happened in America, but local news gathering from newspapers has been greatly undermined by the expansion of the big tech platforms, and we need to make sure that public service broadcasting has a vibrant role to play in the in the world of big tech.
But when you look at Channel 4 privatisation, you look at ditching the BBC licence fee, can people be confident that impartial public service broadcasting is safe under this government?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, with Channel 4, for me, the only question on whether Channel 4 should be privatised is not would it raise some money. It's would a private owner be able to invest more money in Channel 4 than Channel 4 can currently raise from advertising revenue? And if a company could make that investment and then give it bigger resources to do its job, but still vitally keep the Channel 4 remit, so the ethos of what makes Channel 4 unique remains, it would just have the access to more funds to do that job. That for me would be the only reason you would consider privatization. And if it was sold, I would want to make sure the remit was absolutely cast in iron and protected.
Lucy Powell?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with Damien on some things, but I think we probably differ on some others. I mean, I think this sort of gets to the heart of what kind of media, what kind of digital sort of space we want for vibrant democracies going forward. And I think, part of the reason, a big part of the reason really, that British broadcasting is so trusted around the world, that we do have such a strong history and a strong current strength in investigative, impartial, frontline journalism that gets everywhere. Part of that is that public service broadcasting ethos that we have, but also the funding model of the BBC and to some degree Channel 4 as well, because otherwise it becomes a race to the bottom, or a race to the sort of clickbait, a race to the things that are more that attract more views, attract more attention. And I think the whole point of this discussion is that kind of Robert's style journalism and what that represents is the sort of opposite of that in some ways, and it's how we can continue to support that. And I raised this in Parliament yesterday. It's not totally clear really what the government's position now is, but I just don't think things like local news, which the BBC is really the last newsroom standing in most parts of the country now, the World Service, investigative journalism, impartial journalism, could withstand over a period of time a commercial ethos, or an ethos that was trying to drum up subscriptions and so on, because that's not where it's going. That's not what people necessarily choose to pay for. And that universality and that reach right around the country is completely critical to that. And I think that doesn't just extend to the BBC, which is why the work that Damian's done on, brilliant work that Damian and his committee have done on strengthening the online safety bill is also profoundly important to this, because we do have to challenge that the power of the big tech companies, of the way in which algorithms work, the way in which content is rewarded for being controversial, for being very polarizing. It gets rewarded for that, more shared, and is more widely seen. And this is not good for our democracy and the health of our countries, really.
I'll come back to that. We're going to be talking about policy solutions in the final section of this discussion. Brian, I just wanted to ask you, there was a really interesting article in Atlantic magazine, the December issue, saying January the 6th was practice. The idea being that the American media isn't ready for a Trump rerun. What's your response to that?
Right. Well, I think of another Atlantic writer, the editor Jeffrey Goldberg, who was out with the crowd the same time that Robert was, and he came home thinking this was a mass delusion event. This was all a delusion. These people were delusional. Love them, don't love them. They were delusional. And with that in mind, hearing the conversation about social media and about funding structures of media, there are many people in the U.S. that feel left behind for various reasons, maybe for very legitimate reasons, maybe only in their imaginations, but feel left behind. And I worry deeply about what they're consuming, what news or what things that are not actually news, but smell like news, what they're consuming and what they're seeing in their social media feeds. I think we all kind of have a sense in various ways, and some of it's provable, about the impact that these algorithms and feeds are having on people who are already predisposed to distrusting institutions and lashing out against governments in ways that are not constructive but are destructive. I think that's one of the lines we have to draw, between destructive movements and constructive movements. Another line we have to draw is between news sources that are trying their best to get it right versus media outlets that are faking it and don't care what's right and wrong. And that's incredibly difficult to distinguish when you're on the internet, when you're on the wild west of the World Wide Web. You just can't tell. So with all of that in mind, to go back to your question about January 6th, whether it was practice, it was clearly the beginning of something, not the end of something. It in some ways succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of some Trump fans, even though some are now in denial about what happened that day. I think there has to be an ongoing awareness and alert readiness about future attacks of that kind. Political violence is clearly on the rise in the US. We see online radicalization every day, and we are occasionally seeing physical impacts of that online radicalization. But it clearly starts in people's social media feeds and algorithms. So how do we have a better sense of that without choking and without censoring and without making people feel even more disillusioned and even more silenced? It is obviously a massive, massive, profound question.
I mean, just to add, could I just slightly add to that as well? Sorry, yeah. I mean, I think as Robert was saying, and you were saying, Brian, as well, I completely agree that part of the answer to that is to be out there in the field and really representing and giving voice to the plethora of different opinions and groupings, and really representing the people and the country that are the viewers as well. Because if we do go down this road too much, which I think we often do, of a very inside baseball kind of reporting of politics, of what's going on, panel discussions, opinions, oh, he said this to she said no, he's up, he's down, that kind of thing. It then feeds the conspiracy theories. It feeds the sense of people not being represented by the sort of mainstream media, as it gets called here. And it's very important that we do collectively sort of reflect the country that we're trying to represent, and that isn't always the case.
And Brian, I wanted to pick up on something you said and put it to Damien Collins, because Brian said the media has a crucial role in calling a lie a lie. Now, this is something that is very topical here in the UK. I wondered what your advice was, Damien Collins, on how the British media should tackle alleged lying by the Prime Minister.
Well, I think the media is it challenges the Prime Minister, challenges the government in a way you wouldn't see in many other countries of the world. You know, the Prime Minister has to answer questions in a live session. Questions aren't being asked by his opponents, you know, broadcast to the nation and the world. Probably the only leader in the world who subjects himself regularly to that sort of scrutiny, certainly of the sort of a major country. So I think we have those vibrant debates, and the challenge of the media is very important in a democracy. There's a lot more to being a democracy than holding elections. You know, they have elections in Russia, you know, but no one would call that a functioning democracy. So that independent challenge is really important. And, you know, like any other politician in this country, the Prime Minister makes statements and then he's held to account for what he said, you know, and so it's right that we have that robust challenge.
Do you believe the Prime Minister may have misled Parliament?
Well, I don't know all the facts. So that's why I want to see what the Sue Gray's report says, which I believe we will have very soon. And so I think for the sake of a few days, I think we should wait to see those facts, and then we'll be in a much better position to know what happened and determine whether the Prime Minister has accounted for it correctly.
While we're on this subject, though, if he has misled Parliament, presumably you think he should quit.
Well, I mean, let's wait till we know, but clearly the ministerial code sets out the obligations of ministers to be accurate in the information they give the House, and to you know, and importantly, that they knew what they were saying was, you know, was right at the time.
Let's move on to the next session. There's so much to talk about. It's so topical, of course. I want to ask whether what happened in the capital could happen here in the UK. Robert, I wonder what your answer to that was.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, what happens in America, it can very easily happen in other countries too, particularly because we're talking about this sort of global polarization that's fed by algorithms and some of the toxicity of social media feeds. I think that sort of one observation I would have is that, you know, January the 6th was a unique set of circumstances in one sense. It was a profoundly kind of visual story that played to, you know, the strength of television news, and, you know, for all the, you know, recognition our reporters got, it was in a way it unfolded in front of our camera. So the next stage of deep reporting is going to be much more challenging, because it's going to be about what happens at local school boards or local election boards. It's going to be much more micro, if you like. And that plays into one of the great weaknesses we've talked about that's playing out here, but also in the UK, which is the fragility of local journalism. You know, here it's often called a news desert, because of the lack of deep reporting at a local and regional and state level. And I think that's going to be the challenge going forward. You know, Brian has talked about the erosion of democracy. There's nowhere better to chart that than at a local level. And now we don't have the plurality of media at a local level to do that. So January the 6th was this kind of epic visual story, you know, a grand scale across one of the most iconic buildings in the world. And yet the next story, the next really powerful story, could be a local school board in Pennsylvania or in another battleground state, which may not be glamorous, may not lend itself well to the sort of glamour and the architecture of great television, but maybe no less important. And I think that's one of the challenges, not just for us reporters, but also for editorial managers around the world, is how do we report effectively the micro story, which is also a grave threat to democracy.
And Brian, "Murder the media" was scrawled on a door at the Capitol. I know you yourself have been the subject of death threats. I'll ask Robert in a minute, but I know in the course of my reporting, that's also been something that I've endured. And I know, Lucy, I'll bring you in a moment to talk about this, and the sort of personal threats aimed at journalists and politicians. Why do you think journalists have become targets, Brian? And what do media organizations need to do about that?
I think in some ways it's a power struggle, a power move. Donald Trump targeted the media because the media had and has power. The first time he called the networks the enemy of the people, I remember saying on the air that the free press in the US is stronger than any wannabe autocrat. It's stronger than any demagogue. And I very much believe that's true. I believe most Americans see through the smears against the media. But as I said before, there is this smaller group, a very significant minority, but a minority, who do want to believe the lies and the smears, and do want to take out their rage against targets, including the media. Let's recognize that those attacks come from a place of weakness. The people who send me harassing messages and try to threaten me, that's coming from a place of weakness, not strength. It's coming from a place of actually pain and ignorance, if you want to get really deep about it. But in any event, what we need to do, I think, sometimes in newsrooms is tell our own stories more effectively, show that we are human and not these figures on a screen that can just be mocked, ridiculed, and attacked and threatened, but to show that we are citizens just as everyone else, trying to make our country and our world a better place. To the extent that we can get through the camera lens and share that more often, I think we should. But most importantly, to Robert's point earlier, we need to take our voices out and hear others' voices instead, be the conduit for their messages and their points of view. Donny O'Sullivan is doing that for CNN right now in an incredible way. He had a great report last night where he talks to voters and hears their points of view. The more of that we can do, the better. That's, again, vital in the years to come.
Lucy Powell, we've tragically seen the murder of several MPs in the last few years. How toxic is the kind of contemporary mood at the moment, and what are your fears for the future?
Well, I think it's incredibly toxic. As you say, we've had the murder of two MPs in the line of their work. We've also had seismic sort of democratic events. I mean, lots of elections, possibly too many. The Brexit referendum, which was both very divisive, but also, I think, sent a kind of shockwave because it wasn't the sort of perceived outcome. It wasn't the kind of it was very anti-establishment kind of outcome, really, I suppose, in that as well. And we do see, a high level of abuse online. Journalist yourself, Cathy, Laura Koonsberg, it's particularly, if you're a woman as well as being a journalist or as well as being a politician, or if you're, you add on some of these things and you'll get it 10 times more than everybody else. So it does take us back to some of these issues around online regulation. And the role not just of the platforms, but something that I've pushed in the past in Parliament is around the administrators of groups and so on within those platforms, which is often where a lot of the hate is fermented and fostered and amplified, that then goes into offline action as well. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he was attacked a few years ago, in Bristol University, I mean, that was very, very clearly traced back to one particular Facebook group and people on that Facebook group persuading and cajoling others to sort of take action. And that wouldn't happen if that was happening in a workplace or a pub or in a school. That just wouldn't be allowed to foster in that way. So we have got a big gap in the sort of regulatory framework here as well, which we need to address too. But there's no question that we've become a more polarized world, and that we are increasingly occupying our time and our headspace and our thoughts with others that agree with us, rather than opening our eyes to those that don't agree with us, which is, again, I get back to that point I was making earlier, why Robert's style of reporting and that style of reporting is so important. Is actually why, for us as elected politicians, we go and speak to our voters, and they tell us things that perhaps we weren't expecting to hear. And I mean, we are embroiled in Partygate, and did Boris Johnson say this thing on that day? Or actually, do you know what most people said to me over the weekend? They're most worried about whether they're going to be able to pay their energy bills and the cost of living. And can we all just get back onto that topic, please? That's not necessarily what we all think in Westminster, because we all want to carry on talking about who said what when on a certain day about wine cellars and so on.
I am going to come to the solutions that you just raised there, regulatory solutions, in just a moment. But Damian, on that, does social media have a lot of responsibility for amplifying divisive rhetoric? And to what extent are elected representatives themselves to blame for sort of coarsening debate? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
After all this time, you think I'd remember
yeah.
that.
Way of doing things.
So absolutely, social media companies are playing an active role in amplifying hate. There was a Facebook study in 2016 done looking at hate speech in Germany, where they found that the platform they found on the platform that people that had joined Facebook groups which shared extremist content, that over 60% of people that had done that had done it at the active recommendation of the platform itself. If you start engaging with hate speech, then Facebook will recommend more of it to you. And that is, and there have been questions raised about whether their AI systems are anywhere near good enough at detecting the whole set of it. And there was a very good story relating to this, and I think it relates back to 6th of January, that was highlighted by Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, where she talked about the fact that in the build up to the presidential election, Facebook changed the way the algorithm worked so that it favored trusted news sources more than sort of community Facebook groups. And it was the community groups that were considered to be much more problematic in terms of groups that spread disinformation. Now, and they found that this worked really well. After the election, they also decided, though, that unfortunately, although it dampened down conspiracy theories and wild talk on the platform, it also lessened engagement. So they decided after the election to reverse the decision they'd made, and then as a consequence, we saw the explosion of conspiracy theories that led, to the tumult around the 6th of January. I think they should have, with people like Steve Bannon inciting Americans to take to the streets and string people up as they've done in the Revolutionary Wars. The idea that was given a platform by social media companies like Facebook without effective intervention until it was too late is really concerning. So most of what people see on social media is influenced by the platforms themselves. It's not an organic list of content that your friends have most recently published. It is the platform selecting the things they think you're interested in in order to keep you on the site as long as possible and bring you back as frequently as possible. They have this constant decision to make around, do they favor engagement, which helps their business, over safety? And too often they get that call wrong. And that is why they have a responsibility. I think it would be impossible to believe that conspiracy networks like QAnon could have happened without the internet, that the huge explosion in the anti-vaccine movement, vaccine hesitancy around the world could have happened without social media. And social media has a role to play in creating an experience for some people where they predominantly see conspiracy theories. They are led to believe that the mainstream media are liars and can't be trusted. And people are left in a position where they don't really know what to believe anymore. So they probably end up believing the thing they see most.
And just very briefly, how much are elected representatives, I'm not just talking about in this country, but I think it includes this country, but the states as well, with Donald Trump, how much do politicians themselves need to accept responsibility for stoking that divisive rhetoric?
Well, I think they should be held to account for stoking it. Absolutely. Now, they can be held to account by being challenged by their public statements. But I think what the platforms also have to do is when it's clear that someone's speech is actually endangering other people. So the decision to deplatform Donald Trump on the 6th of January was that his statements were seen as inciting the riot, inciting the violence that led to it. And so in those situations, as with anyone else whose speech could incite real physical harm to others, then they should be removed from the platform if that happens. But of course, there is a concern I have, particularly when you look at America, particularly when you look at some of the people that have been elected to Congress, is these are people who seem to delight in conspiracy theories and see conspiracy theories as being helpful to their cause, and that is massively irresponsible.
We've got some great questions coming in, and I promise I will take some questions at the end, but I'm just going to rattle through our final topic, which is what policy solutions that are needed to promote and sustain journalism. And Lucy's already touched on some of these, but Robert, I just wanted to, if you could kick off on this section, how you think the governments and around the world and regulatory frameworks need to assist public service journalism for the public good.
It strikes me that there are 2 points to this. Well, one is that, it's important for us as journalists to have sort of humility. Where people criticize us, we need to look in the mirror and acknowledge that, we're not perfect conveyors of every news event on every day, on every bulletin. But, British television's got a lot going for it. We're in a competitive landscape, just as we should be, where Sky and ITV News and Channel 4 News and the BBC are competing for stories out in the field. But ultimately, beyond that, we're also kind of a collaborative ecosystem where we are supportive of each other. We all believe in the same mission. from my point of view, what we're looking for is, these sort of light touch sort of guardrails from regulators, from lawmakers, from Parliament, and from Ofcom. But otherwise, just let us get on with our job. We will do it. We will find those stories. We will tell those stories. We have this ethos where we don't believe stories come from, newsrooms or studios. We believe they're best told by people out in the field. We will listen to people's stories if we have that sort of, that regulatory framework where people can trust our brand, and then we're just let on to get on with it and to do what we do best, which is reporting in the field. And I'm full of praise for, for how we have this competitive television news structure at the moment. Every day I wake up and worry what my competition is up and doing. And that's a healthy place for us to be, so long as we have that broad sort of supportive political and regulatory framework.
Brian, how should the social media platforms, should they be made to pay for news, for example?
There's been a lot of movement in that direction, and we've seen Rupert Murdoch and other executives push very hard over the matter of years for that. We've now seen versions of this start to take place in Australia and elsewhere, and now there are these financial arrangements, more and more of them in different ways every month, where Facebook and Google and others are in various ways funding and subsidizing journalism. You see that with Facebook hiring people to write newsletters. You see that with Google providing accelerator programs. Whether it's of the right proportion and the right amount, I'll let others decide. I do think it's significant that there has been a lot of movement on that front. There's also a lot that governments can do to provide public support for journalism. And what we need are more and more of those ideas and more creative ideas. Just to give you one small example, for many decades, many governments in the United States bought advertising in print newspapers, let people know about events and notices, public notices. That kind of funding support actually was a baseline for those newspapers. So you've seen New York City, where I am, double down on trying to spend money with local publications in an indirect way to keep those publications alive. They don't control the content, the editorial, they don't have a say, but they are providing a financial lifeline in that way. So, there's a lot of different ways governments can provide public support. When it comes to social media and this conversation about the extremism and radicalization we've seen, I think governments have to focus on the supply issue. That is, what are these algorithms doing? Where is this supply of crazy content coming from? How are the platforms held accountable? What journalists and newsrooms really should focus on is not advocating for regulation, advocating for change, but focusing on the demand side. What's the demand? What's the root cause? Why is there a demand for these conspiracy theories and disinformation? That's what Robert's report did on January 6th. That's what the best of journalism does every day, focuses on what's going on the demand side, and then let others deal with what should be done, what should be changed.
Damien Collins, I know we don't have much time left, but if you could address in your answer both what to do about online harms, given that the online safety bill is, delayed again, and also this idea of how best to sustain public service journalism.
Sure. So, on the online safety bill, obviously the Joint Committee has published its report. That was the pre-legislative scrutiny of the bill. The government has said the bill will be presented to Parliament in this session. So that really means before the end of April. And although this has taken a long time, we'll still be the first country in the world to look to introduce such a wide-ranging regulator. Some of the powers that the regulator will have, I think, are helpful in two ways. One is that there will be powers then to challenge the companies on the dissemination of knowingly false information that could cause physical harm or deep psychological harm to a likely audience of people online. There will be liabilities. The regulator could also produce proper transparency reports so we could see, how much hate speech do they actually remove, and what role do groups and channels play in radicalizing people. We could actually start to get proper data and information out of the companies and just discuss that in a public way, which I think could really challenge them in the way they run their systems. I think there is a question around remuneration for news providers. If their content is being widely used to engage people on social media platforms, but they don't get anything back for it, I think that is a challenge. I think also a lot of the debate around the online environment has been around safety in recent years. There's a debate rapidly following it on competition. And I think if news providers can say, well, actually, I've got no choice but to use YouTube and Facebook and Instagram to try and reach my audiences, but those platforms are clearly biased against me and favor other sources of news. There's no fair access, no fair carriage for my products on these platforms. I think we could see some interesting debates around competition law to try and create more of a level playing field, which would also have the benefit of giving users a much better plurality of opinions and different sources of news to engage with. And I think that is the challenge, to make sure that the great news that is being produced by fantastic journalists is actually getting in front of people. You can reach people with it. It's been relatively easy in the past because the routes to market have been controlled by the companies themselves, but now they're having to go through intermediaries. So how do you make sure they get a fair share of voice? I think both in terms of online safety, but also competition law, that's going to be a really interesting and important debate.
And Lucy, briefly, if you would, I know you're new in the job, so I'm putting you on the spot, but your answer to what Damien's just set out.
Well, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything Damien just said there. I think if the government take on board wholesale his committee's recommendations, which are very many and deep, and a real restructure of the bill, then you'll be considerably much further on with that than we would otherwise be. But that remains to be seen. I mean, look, I think in short, as Damien was saying earlier, the social media platforms in particular, and the other internet platforms are incredibly powerful things. I mean, probably never has the power to change opinions, to shape markets, to shape countries, been in the hands of so few as it kind of is in a way these days. So we do need now, I think, an era of democratizing that, so that power is now back in the hands of the many rather than the few, if you like, and that's going to be quite a big oil tanker to turn around. But Damien set out some areas of doing that in terms of competition, regulation, and other things there as well. And obviously algorithms and AI has got to sit right in the middle of that too. And I think we do need a new settlement really as well around how we reward and value trusted, impartial news gathering, which the way in which social media, and that feeds through into other media, works doesn't necessarily do that anymore, because you get rewarded for controversy and so on, and just it may turn out to be sort of more boring, but I mean that's the way it goes as well. But I think all hope isn't lost. I mean, the most trusted, the most watched, the most valued programmes on the BBC, for example, are the evening regional bulletins at 6:30, because people also want to go local and they want to know actually what's happening in their communities and on their doorsteps, and they are much less interested. I think this is a big question. They're much less interested in the sort of lobby-based, inside baseball sort of way in which we often cover politics here and in other countries as well. And perhaps some of that really does need looking at as well.
Okay, we've got loads of questions. I want to get through as many as we can in the next 4 minutes, which is a big ask. So if I could ask you to keep your answers short, that'd be great. Steve Barnett says, does the role of Fox News in the US in promoting Trump's lies demonstrate why we need to keep our impartiality rules in broadcasting? Very brief answer from Brian, and then Robert, please. Brian.
The brief answer would be yes. The longer answer would be Americans would, I think, benefit from something like Ofcom, where they can be heard. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. I know that's very, that can be very controversial, but Americans would benefit.
Robert.
Yeah, share Brian's view. Certainly Ofcom is a template that would do well in America. And yes, the poison, the toxicity, the polarization, the fact that cable stations are in their ideological stations and silos is certainly very problematic going forward.
Right, so this is a related question from Ivor Gaber, who says, this is for you, Damien. If lying is to become part of the political landscape, should media/election regulators think about changing their guidelines to enable reporters to call out lying politicians without apparently breaching their guidelines? And I suppose I'd like to just add that I don't think there's anything stopping us calling out lying politicians, but subsequent question to you is, what if you call out a lying politician and the said politician insists they weren't lying? Damien.
Well, you should call out anyone who's lying to try and influence the public to believe something in particular. And there are also not just journalists to do it, but fact-checking organizations that challenge people based on the facts. The question then is what do people believe? And that's why I think this debate around where people get their news from and who they get it from is really important, because if people largely see news where that politician isn't being challenged, or other people reinforce what they've said and it's clearly not true, then it's more likely people will believe it, regardless of what journalists say. In the same vein, someone could be telling the truth but is drowned out by other people asserting that they're lying. So it's absolutely essential the challenge is there, but also essential that people have access to different opinions.
But what if the politician in question continues to insist they're not lying, but the journalists and the public don't believe them?
Well, that politician will probably lose.
Do you believe Downing Street's account then of what happened at all these parties, May 20th in particular?
Well, again, on May 20th, the Prime Minister set out, his statement in the House of Parliament about what he believes happened, what he knew at the time about the nature of that event. But it's right that is now subject to an independent investigation, and when that report is published, we will have more facts, and we will be in a better position to judge those remarks. I'm sorry to sound like a stuck record on that, but I do think it is important that report is allowed to be produced, and then we will know a lot more.
Right, David Putnam says, in June 2020, we published a comprehensive House of Lords report on the impact of disinformation entitled Digital Technology and the Resurrection of Trust, which was all but ignored by the media. Yet the report actually predicted the fragile state of Western democracy. Was the report ignored simply because it came from the House of Lords? Or was it because the depth of the problem was in itself largely being ignored, even 6 months ahead of this terrible event? Brief response from Robert and then Brian.
Well, I can't comment on that House of Lords report, but I mean, certainly, there has been foreshadowing of what happened on January the 6th. It should not have come as a surprise. In fact, what I said, in that report in real time, at like 2:15 p.m. on the 6th of January was this shouldn't come as a surprise. It's come as a consequence of years of incendiary rhetoric. So in no way was it a surprise, and undoubtedly there has been sort of solid work done in this area. But Damien's right. We need to absorb the lessons and understand that plurality of discussion is going to be at the core of all of it, making sure that people, consumers of news, get a broad range of opinions in front of them.
And the key words there are a resurrection of trust. The last part of that title, how can trust be resurrected? How can we every day in little ways, step by step, restore the trust that's been lost? It's, this is a game of inches, inch by inch by inch. How can we restore trust?
And just very final question to you, Damian. Maggie Brown says, Channel 4 is currently playing a key role in the levelling up government plans. Why is it being put under additional stress as it reconfigures itself? Would any commercial buyer want to carry on with the out of London policy? I did not put her up to that, by the way, can I just say?
Well, no, I think the Channel 4's movement into the regions has been great, not just moving to Leeds, but also the regional commissioning hubs. And I think it will be, I think Channel 4 will benefit hugely from it, as will the production companies that work with them. The question really is, I have every sympathy that Channel 4 wants to know what's going to happen so it can plan for the future, whatever that future will be. As I said earlier, for me, the only challenge really over Channel 4 is that, if you look around the world, standalone advertiser-funded television companies there aren't very many of them. There's a good reason for that. It's not, most television companies that are successful make their own programs, and Channel 4 can't because of its remit. So the question would be is, if a private investor came in and said, we'll keep the Channel 4 remit, but we will provide Channel 4 with access to funds that are far greater than it can currently raise from advertising revenue, which is its only form of income, then we could see a better Channel 4 with more resources, able to commission more great programming, invest even more in news, and that could be good, but only if the remit is protected. So I think given the nature of the television industry and how fast it's changing, these are perfectly legitimate questions to ask. But that for me is the test. Will we have a bigger, better Channel 4 if it was privatized? But either way, I think Channel 4 needs to know what's going to happen, because I completely understand that it is frustrating if you've got this big question mark over you and you can't find out the answer.
Thank you, all our panelists. Excellent panel. It was a great discussion. Thank you to the RTS for arranging all of this. Thank you to ITN for hosting it. And thank you to all the people tuning in. And there's some great questions, some illustrious inquisitors as well. Thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed that. Goodbye.